Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today, my guest is J.T. Turner. J.T. did his PhD at the University of Edinburgh, and he teaches at Anderson University. And today, we're talking about bodies and souls. J.T., thanks for talking with me.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Sheb.
Of course.
Glad to be here.
So the first question I wanted to ask you is how you got interested in this topic of bodies and souls. What prompted you to want to spend some time working on this?
Right, good. So back when I was doing my first master's degree, I had to do a research thesis for it. And I was struggling to come up with a topic, and I just happened to be reading during my sort of morning quiet times, to use the evangelical phrasing, reading Matthew 22. And in Matthew 22, Jesus has this really interesting showdown with the Sadducees about the resurrection. And they're trying to stump him about, suppose this woman had 7 husbands, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? They're trying to suggest that resurrection is nonsense. And Jesus, in responding, cites Exodus 3 as his defense of the resurrection. And I thought, what on earth is going on there? And the more I thought about it, the more the research drove me into, ancient Near Eastern and particularly Jewish thoughts about the resurrection, ancient Greek thoughts about the resurrection or possibility of resurrection, and then, of course, more and more biblical studies about the resurrection, more and more theological studies about the resurrection, and then that prompted all kinds of philosophical questions, because I was doing an MA in philosophy at the time. So, yeah, it was just kind of a swirl of puzzles that popped into my head. And one of the clear things that came out of my just thinking about the topic generally was just how front and center the bodily resurrection is to Christian theology. And it seemed clear to me, in any case, that one of the fundamental reasons that the resurrection is super important for Christian theology is just because, at least so I say, humans are embodied beings, and I think necessarily so. So that, was basically the genesis of how I got into the topic.
Okay. Maybe you can sort of roughly sketch out for us the general landscape when it comes to the different philosophical views about the human person. I know there's lots of nuance and varieties of this, but could you describe what are some of the main positions out there?
Yeah, so let me give 3 main positions. Well, there's really 2 main positions. I'm going to give a third one because it's my position, and I want to think it's main, but it's really not.
Okay.
So the 2, big players in philosophical anthropology and or philosophy of mind, whatever you want to call it. Basically, it's philosophers attempting to answer the question, what's a human, or what am I? In analytic philosophy, anyway, the 2 main views that are out there are what we call substance dualism. That is to say that a human being, when fully considered, is 2 individual substances that are acting in concert in some way. And the ways those, the way that works gets cashed out variously by various substance dualists. But generally speaking, the idea is that we've got a soul or mind as a substance, an existing thing, interacting with a human organism, the animal to which we're all in some way related. Typically speaking, the substance dualists have in mind that whatever a soul or mind is, probably something like a thinking thing, to follow along with René Descartes' way of phrasing it. Whatever that is, we are identical to the soul or mind. So when thinking really about what a person is, maybe even a human person, what we really are souls, and we are contingently or accidentally related to human organisms. So that's That's a main view in the philosophy of mind and philosophical anthropology. That's the dominant view in the Christian tradition and in Christian philosophy. That is not the dominant view in philosophy generally. The dominant view in philosophy generally is the other one, called what we might call physicalism, or what used to be called materialism. And that is just the idea that human beings are physical or material objects all the way down. We basically are what the physics and the biological sciences say we are. Something like structured organisms and or the smallest individual material parts, indivisible material parts there are, what we might call them atoms, arranged in a human-like way. Again, how that gets parsed out will depend on which physicalist or materialist you're talking to, but the idea there is they're just going to deny that humans have anything like an immaterial soul or mind, that mind is just another term for either the functioning of the brain or something that supervenes on the brain or something that is just identical with the gray matter in your skull.
Okay.
Those are the two main views. The third view, if you want me to mention, is just what I call, well, not what I call, it's called hylomorphism. It starts in Aristotle, takes a break for a while, and then gets brought back to prominence in the medieval tradition with the scholastics, and then is gaining more prominence now, which is why I like to say that it's a third main position, even though it really isn't. It's a minority. But hylomorphism is not just a thesis about the human. It's actually a thesis about stuff generally. And what we say is that everything that exists, save for maybe God, is a matter-form composite, where what we mean by matter is a explanatory principle that we also can call potentiality, and form is an explanatory principle that we might call actuality. So a really easy kind of way to think about it is, as I run through with my undergraduate students, imagine you're watching a movie and two characters that are translucent ghosts are playing a game and they're throwing something back and forth. Could you tell if that something is a football and it's a translucent object as well? And if so, how could you do it? And of course, most students will say, oh, well, we could tell by the way it's shaped. And exactly, that's what form is meant to do. I mean, in a very sort of easy way of understanding it. It's a forming and structuring principle of an object that makes it the object that it is and explains why it's not some other object. So chairs are chairs because they're formed like chairs rather than, say, tables or dogs or cats. Dogs are dogs because they're formed like dogs and they're not formed like cats or squirrels or trees or humans, and so on and so on. So the idea is that every individual object there is a combination of matter and form. They are neither fully and reductively explained in physical terms, nor are they primarily immaterial objects. They are one substance composed of matter and form, and that's my own particular view.
Okay. So if we can talk a little bit more about the matter and form relationship for a second. So in the past, we've talked about one possible way of thinking about, like, let's say human beings is like our matter might be something like muscle tissue or carbon or something like that. But there's also a different way of talking about matter. Could you flesh that out? No pun intended. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, good. So depending on the hylomorphist, you're going to get different ways of cashing this out. So some hylomorphists will just say that when they talk about form matter composite, they mean matter in the sense that the sciences talk about matter, things that have mass and take up space. So atoms or, particles or flesh or whatever. That to me is not matter in the technical sense that at least the early scholastics wanted to say about matter. And as far as I read Aristotle, which admittedly is through the lens of Thomas Aquinas, so take that with a grain of salt. What he means by matter, likewise, isn't the stuff you can see under a microscope. That kind of matter, the stuff you can see under a microscope, is what the scholastics called secondary matter. It is a principle of potentiality in an important sense, right? So you might think that there are certain potentialities about me as a human that I have because I'm an organic structure. I, don't have the potential to, say, survive on the surface of the sun. I don't have, with the kind of lung tissue I have and so on, I don't have the potential to breathe underwater because I don't have gills, and so on. So you might think that if we're pointing to potential, what gives me the potentials that I do, that this kind of secondary stuff I'm made out of informs that, and that's right. But the fundamental metaphysical sort of potentiality that hylomorphists want to appeal to is what we call prime matter. And prime matter is Jeffrey Brower, who's a Thomist scholar, calls it a stuff of no kind. And even that, I think, that's a good way to phrase what's hard to put into terms, because prime matter, technically speaking, cannot exist in its own right. It can only ever exist as that informed matter, that secondary matter that we can see and so on, matter that's already received a form. Prime matter is pure potentiality, okay? So nothing actual about it. The way we come to know about prime matter, and the reason we want to postulate it as a real entity at all, is, at least according to the scholastics and myself, and Ed Feser and others, is by way of just our own mental abstractions. When we're thinking about how to explain how something that actually exists potentially came to be the sort of thing it is, we need to be able to appeal to some principle of potentiality that is not already actualized in some way. And so by parity of reasoning, we get to a substratum of pure potentiality that we call prime matter.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's two kinds of matter in hylomorphism, usually anyway. You got that secondary matter, that's the stuff we all know as matter that has mass and take up space. And then there's a metaphysical kind of prime matter, which is it is not a thing that exists apart from already being informed, having received a form of some kind.
Okay. So this secondary matter, like carbon atoms, even carbon atoms would be a composite of form and matter still. It wouldn't be this prime matter.
That's right. So
right,
a carbon atom is prime matter having received the form of carbon, which is why we know it's a carbon atom as opposed to something else. It's actually a carbon atom, and it's being a carbon atom provides for us it's actually having the powers that it does and the potentialities that it does. It explains why it's in fact that thing, as opposed to, say, a hydrogen atom or something like that. Okay,
got it. So this term often shows up in the literature about this animalism, or that human beings are animals. So could you kind of explain what that term means when people say human beings are essentially animals or something like that? Could you just flesh that out for us?
Yeah, good. So again, when we're thinking about trying to answer the question of what is a human being, physicalists want to say that human beings just are the thing that's sitting in your chair or driving your car or whatever. It's that organic body moving about. And they want to explain that, again, in exhaustively physical terms or material terms. They want to say there's nothing immaterial about you. Everything can exhaustively be explained by physics at some point. Now, what has come out of that sort of reasoning is thinking about what we're doing when we say that humans are organisms, living organisms of a particular kind. Well, there's a particular kind of organism that we are, and we've known this since at least Aristotle, namely that we're animals. We've got, a digestion, we've got appetites, we've got locomotion, we've got sense capabilities, like we've got sense data and sensory nerves and so on. And so, Aristotle thought humans were rational animals, which, side note, I agree. Physicalists say, right, we're animals, and so we say, so they say we're identical to these things, and that's the thesis, that if humans are identical, like animalism is just a thesis that humans are identical to particular animal organisms, namely human animal organisms. We're not mere animals. We are rational animals, at least, so we're not like dogs and cats. We're animals in the generic sense, like dogs and cats are, but we, of course, are a separate sort of species. So that's animalism in a nutshell. But at least to my mind, it's not clear to me that physicalists are the only ones that can make that move. I think also hylomorphists can say that we're animals. It's just that when we investigate the nature of the animal, we're going to come out with different explanations, in just the same way as the physicalist and the hylomorphist are going to come out with different explanations for what the chair is that I'm sitting on.
Okay, so you can be a physicalist and an animalist, and you can be a hylomorphist and an animalist.
Yes, so I say anyway. So, you've got Eric Olson, and he's a physicalist. He says, he wants to give a physicalist outworking of animalism, but a guy named Patrick Toner, I think, is the first one to make the connection with hylomorphism, and I followed Patrick Toner in that way of thinking.
Okay, so could you explain why you think the hylomorphic picture of that animalist picture of the human person is better than the physicalist one?
Yes. So the reason I think that the hylomorphic view is better than, say, the physicalist view is really not so much its explanatory power about humans. I think that primarily the issue for me is explanatory power for the nature of reality generally. See, I think that the fundamental metaphysical problem that metaphysics was sort of not invented but used to solve is the problem that we call the one and the many. You've probably heard of that problem before. And in the problem of change, which the problem of change is just a species of the problem of the one and the many. So, the problem of the one and the many is a cluster of problems, but one of the issues at the heart of it is this fundamental sort of philosophical principle that identical things have to have all and only the same properties. That's like part of what it is for one thing to be strictly or numerically identical to another. So if I say object A just is the same object as object B, they better not have any differences. If there's any differences at all, then they're two objects, not one. Okay? So the problem of the one and the many generates with that in the following way, right? So we look out in the field and we see a bunch of tigers. Well, we want to say that there's one thing there, namely tiger, and yet at the same time there are many things, i.e. tigers. And that seems like a contradiction because one is, at least you could plausibly say it is semantically equivalent to the claim not many. So a thing can't be both many and not many at the same time. Okay, so now how do we solve that problem? Well, however we solve that problem, it's probably going to have to be a solution that helps us account for problems of persistence. So Sheb, say, 2 seconds ago, has different properties than Sheb has 2 seconds later.
Yeah.
Got the property of being 2 seconds younger 2 seconds ago and the property of being 2 seconds older now.
Right.
But if you were identical, it seems like you can't have any distinguishing properties at all.
Right. When I think about, my 5-year-old self had different skin cells, and I've lost a bunch of skin cells since I've been 5, and I've gained a bunch of hair and skin cells since I've been 5, but somehow I have some kind of relationship to my 5-year-old self.
Exactly. And so, the ancient Greeks, when they were posed with this problem, they originally went off the side of the horse, if you like, of either of two ways. So you had those that said, well, look, given these problems, It's just the case there's no change at all. There's no distinguishing any objects at all. Everything is just one. Everything is a static, whole one, because we've got this problem of identity. On the other side, they said, oh no, it's not just that everything is one, it's that there literally is no thing at all. That everything is many manys all the way down. So we can infinitely divide you, we can infinitely divide species, we can infinitely divide the thing we think changes over time. It's not a thing at all, it's just infinitely many manys all the way down. Anytime we land on something we think is an individual, we can cut it in half again, which is just to say that there's nothing, right? That's not, that's a kind of nihilism, right? So we have either monism, that there's just one thing, or we've got nihilism, which is there are no things. They all agree that whatever we want to say, there's no change, because change requires a persisting subject.
Right.
And that there aren't many things, individual things. There's either one thing or there's no things. Now, I think that physicalism ends up being committed to the claim, even if they don't recognize this, that there's no individual object. Okay, so most physicalists, they run out of explanatory power for how to account for identity over time. Now you've got some physicalists. Here's one, Trenton Merrick's, who thinks that the way to solve identity problems is just to say there aren't any criteria or informative conditions about identity over time, that identity over time is just like a brute fact, or self-explanatory if brute is too harsh a word, which is counterintuitive. Most of us want to say that when we provide the condition, when we explain ontologically something's identity over time, there actually is something that we can use to explain it. They've got some informative, necessary, and sufficient conditions. Merrick thinks that on analysis, physicalism doesn't actually provide those. In fact, all physicalist attempts to answer the question reduce to tautologies. Hence, he wants to say self-explanatory. And he thinks the same thing is true of dualism.
Okay.
Eventually, you're going to go, why is the one soul identical to at one time identical to a soul at a further time? Well, just because it is. What he's going to say happens on both accounts. I think that even if that were the case, it's still the case that most physicalists think that space and material objects are continuous. That is to say, potentially infinitely divisible. And hopefully, if you're thinking along with me, you'll hear in the background the nihilists of years gone by screaming, that's just claiming there are no things, which is nihilism. And I think, obviously, because I'm a Christian, that monism just is, I reject nihilism and monism for the same reasons. Namely, I think God created individual objects besides himself. Okay, so what's the way to solve this problem? Well, the reason that the nihilists and the monists got off on the right track was they thought things either were purely actual, and so one static thing, or else purely potential, and so nothing. Hylomorphists want to say, nope, here's the way to solve it. This is why Aristotle does this. Things have to be combinations of potentiality and actuality in order to be able to explain over time the persisting substance. Something's got to persist through there. And if we can build into every individual object both potentiality and actuality, then we can explain change over time, both in substances, or I should say changes to substances, and also changes in substances. So one substance changing into another one, as opposed to the idea that one substance gets obliterated and then something brand new gets brought into existence out of whole cloth. To explain just regular old common sense intuitions about the way the world works, I think hylomorphism does a better job. And so I adopt hylomorphism as an entire worldview, and part and parcel of that is explaining what humans are.
Got it. Okay.
It's a really long answer, but
no,
I think it takes a while.
Yeah, no, that was good. So you've mentioned the identity over time piece, that's going to be a big problem for the physicalist. So why not substance dualism?
Yeah, so I think that if substance dualism or physicalism are right or are correct, then I think Trenton Merrick's his idea about identity over time has got to be correct. Because I am persuaded that either way you slice it, suppose you want to appeal to souls, and I ask, okay, what makes it the case that Sheb's soul at time t1 is the same soul, numerically the same soul as Sheb's soul at time t10? Well, you're probably going to give me some kind of analysis about the necessary and sufficient conditions of identity for souls, and probably, at least if Merrick's is right, and I think he is, that explanation is going to reduce to Sheb's soul at time t1 is identical to Sheb's soul at time t10, if and only if Sheb's soul at time t1 is identical to Sheb's soul at time t10. That is to say, it's a tautology, which is that's not false. It's just that I think, given our intuitions about wanting to provide explanatory criteria, if we can provide them, which I think hylomorphism does, then we should opt for the view that does. Because look, I mean, some people think that appealing to the soul sort of avoids the problem of change that, say, material objects have. And I just think that that's wrong. I mean, consider, right? You've got different properties that even if you're a soul, now that you won't have 10 seconds from now, like you're thinking different thoughts. You've got the property of thinking this thought rather than the thought you're thinking at 10 seconds from now. And so I think the puzzle just generates all over again. I think appealing to an immaterial soul because it doesn't undergo physical change just pushes the problem back a step.
Okay. And yet Christians have held to this position throughout the majority of the tradition. Do you have any sense as to why it's been so widely held?
Yes. So I think if you go with the Aristotelian route, like if you think that humans are identical to organisms, then attempting to explain how dead people come back to life is extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah.
You've got famous puzzles like the cannibal problem.
Yeah.
Or just the general problem of, well, what happens when all my material stuff dissolves and gets assumed into other humans, say, over the course of millennia, right, or whatever you want to say, right? So right. It's just hard to figure out how bodies die and come back to life.
Right, which is a real problem that Christians wrestled with. Right?
Yeah, exactly. from the get-go, they did.
Yeah.
But if you could appeal to a soul as carrying your identity, and the soul does not suffer death in the way that an organism does, then I don't have to account for how you remain alive. It just becomes part and parcel of what it is to be a soul.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the main philosophically responsible reason. I think there's some other historical things going on in the background. So if you read, early Christians who are interacting with Plato at all, a lot of them, and I think this is pretty well true until kind of late Augustine, because you can tell Augustine changes his mind about the following thing from early works to later works. I think there was kind of a general notion that Plato was something like a pre-Christ Christian. If you have, coinciding ideas like, appealing to the soul gives me an easier apologetic strategy. Plus, it's the case that Plato might have been like a pre-Christ Christian. Then he becomes kind of a friendly interlocutor. And of course, Plato, I think I might have skipped a step here. Plato is, he's one of the original kind of substance dualists.
Right. I don't know if this may be putting you on the spot, but I don't know if you've read Richard Swinburne's most recent work or if you have any thoughts on his arguments for substance dualism.
Yeah, so what's the most recent work you're referring to?
Are we bodies or souls? I think that's what I'm thinking.
I haven't read that one yet, but I'm pretty familiar with most of his arguments. So here's two things I want to say about Swinburne's arguments generally. First of all, I think that he uses the term thing too loosely. By thing, he means what I would call substance, and he just wants to say, pretty much anything that the English lexicon would call a thing, that is a substance. So he's going to include chairs and houses and bookshelves and all kinds of ordinary objects, where I just think that that's wrong. And I think substances have to be more explanatory, fundamental. Here, I agree with Trent Merricks, who is something of a nihilist about macro objects that aren't organisms, and I'm kind of that way too. About macro objects, but I affirm that space is not infinitely divisible, so there are some physical things that are not further dividable. So we can call those things atoms, whatever they end up being. And then, so those things exist, and then organisms exist. That fundamentally what we have to do when we figure out what things are, or substances are, is make sure that when we're explaining the things they do, that the whole is not explanatorily redundant. And I think that for most macro objects outside of living organisms, appealing to the macro object is redundant. So when I want to explain why the desk is doing what the desk is, actually appealing to the desk doing anything becomes redundant, because I can fully explain it in terms of its individual parts. In any case, I can't do that with humans and dogs and cats, nor can I do that with atoms. In any case, so I think when Swinburne is cashing out his views about what exists, I think it's just too loose as far as that goes. Secondly, he consistently appeals to the so-called modal argument for dualism. Yeah. And I find that to be epistemologically question-begging. I don't think it makes the argument invalid, of course, because I think it's not a formal fallacy. But I think it's just rhetorically ineffective, completely rhetorically ineffective. The modal argument says, look, there are modal properties that you have that your body doesn't have. Namely, you've got the modal property of possibly surviving the loss of your body. And of course, your body doesn't have that modal property.
Right.
And that just sounds to me like you already have to buy the idea that I'm not identical with my body, and I just don't buy that. So I just think, no, that first premise in the argument is false. Yeah. And at that point, it's just me and Richard clashing intuitions. Right, right. I don't find his argument convincing in the slightest. Right. And the more, and of course, the more I think about animalism and hylomorphism, the more and more strange substance dualism seems to me. Yeah. Like, not just strange, but counterintuitive. Okay. That's interesting. I recall in a previous conversation we had, I just want you to say something nice about substance dualism, JT, is what I'm getting at. But, yes. Well, look, it's like I tell my undergraduate students, your friendly neighborhood philosophy professor holds a lot of minority weird views about stuff. So just because I say it doesn't make it true. And and substance dualism is completely philosophically viable. I don't find it incoherent in the slightest. Yeah. Thanks a lot, JT, for talking. This has been really helpful. Thanks, Sheb. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and please share with your friends.